A rhetorical look at Aristotle's The Art of Rhetoric. We are all familiar with the term a rhetorical question. The phrase is thrown around all of the time, but we never really stop to think about where it comes from or what it truly means. In a nutshell, rhetoric can be defined as the art of persuasion. When someone asks a question only to cut off your response with the statement, "That was a rhetorical question," what they are truly saying is that the question itself was intended to persuade you, and that it really required no answer. However, it is not fair to nutshell rhetoric. It has roots deeply embedded in several areas, including sociology and history, but today is practiced more fully in English, speech, and communication. Because Aristotle is commonly regarded as the father of rhetoric as we know it, for our purposes, we will focus on rhetoric as it applies to philosophy. Aristotle's Rhetoric was written in two different periods between 367 and 347 BCE, and 335 and 332 BCE, and many historians align these time periods with Aristotle's two stays in Athens. The work wasn't actually intended to be published originally. Rather, it was a collection of a student's notes of Aristotle's teachings. Just as the writing occurred in multiple segments, rhetoric is made up of multiple books. The ancient catalog of Aristotelian works mentions only two books. These books are commonly referred to as Rhetoric I and Rhetoric II. There are also two later books that focus on the style of rhetoric, considered by some to be Rhetoric III, whereas Rhetoric I and II focus on the technicalities that make up the core of rhetoric. The term technical in this case means two things. The first is that the persuasion relies on a method, further meaning that we must be able to recognize why a certain technique is persuasive. The other is that the persuasiveness must come from the speaker, him or herself. This means that pre-existing facts are not technical means of persuasion, for they do not come from the speaker directly. Examples would be testimony in a court of law as from a witness. Think of it like this. If Rhetoric I and II lay down the rules of the game, Rhetoric III would be a strategy guide of how to play the game. The rhetorician, as defined by Aristotle, is someone who can always keep sight of what is persuasive. Similarly, rhetoric is commonly defined as the ability to see what is possibly persuasive in any given situation. This doesn't mean that the rhetorician will always be successful in persuading their audience regardless of the circumstance. A quote from Christoph Rapp, a German ethics and philosophy professor, explains it very well. Rapp states, "Rather, he is in a similar situation as the physician. The latter has a complete grasp of his art only if he neglects nothing which might heal his patient, though he is not able to heal every patient. Similarly, the rhetorician has a complete grasp of his method if he discovers the available means of persuasion, though he is not able to convince everybody." Rhetoric I and II are separated into two large parts, each including three subsections. The first larger section is broken into three modes or means of persuasion. Since a speech is made up of three parts, it only makes sense that there are only three modes of persuasion. The parts of a speech are the speaker, the audience to which the speech is being delivered, and the subject being spoken about. As a result, the three modes of persuasion are ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is achieved by establishing one's credibility in order to persuade the audience. In order to establish ethos or credibility, the speaker must be knowledgeable in regards to that which they are speaking of. They must also come off to the audience as one possessing virtuous character and goodwill. It is important that these three things are established by what the speaker is saying, for these qualities cannot be established by pre-existing facts, or they are not truly persuasive. The speaker must be able to possess all three qualities in the delivery of the speech, for if one is missing while the other two are present, it leaves the door open for doubt to flood into the audience's mind, and the speech cannot be truly persuasive. Today we would consider this quality to be charisma, and anyone who has ever watched a political debate knows that the speaker's ability to be charismatic has won or lost elections. The second mode of persuasion is pathos, which draws on the audience's emotions as a means of persuasion. How successfully an argument persuades an audience is just as dependent on the emotional state of the audience as it is on the credibility of the speaker. We do not judge in the same way when we are happy as when we are sad, or when we are feeling compassionate as opposed to feeling vengeful. Since emotion has an incredible effect on our decisions, it is extremely important to control this variable in order to be persuasive. Just look at the approval rating of the war in Iraq when the campaign first began, shortly after September 11th, as opposed to now when the nationwide feeling of fear and revenge has worn off considerably. The final mode of persuasion is logos, which uses the logic of the argument itself to persuade. In an ideal situation, the argument would be so overwhelmingly sound in itself that it is enough to be persuasive. However, as already established, providing a logically sound argument by itself cannot be truly persuasive without having established credibility and aligning the audience's emotions to a degree that is conducive to their cooperation in being persuaded. Aristotle identified the two types of arguments common to philosophy today. These are the inductive and deductive arguments. In order to achieve logos, one must be able to prove something to the audience so that it may be presented as factual and therefore persuasive. By utilizing the inductive and deductive arguments in the speech, the orator can achieve the persuasive effect sought through logos. Only by fulfilling ethos, pathos, and logos is an argument truly persuasive. However, that is not to say that one is required to fulfill all three in order to persuade an audience. That all depends on the audience and their willingness to be persuaded in some cases. However, one must not expect to persuade their audience without taking ethos, logos, and pathos into account, whereas by fulfilling all three, the audience's willingness does not come into play, for the speech is truly persuasive. After the three means of persuasion are established, Aristotle moves on to establish the three species of public speaking, which make up the second broad section of Rhetoric 1 and 2 that is broken down into three smaller parts. A speech delivered in an assembly is known as the deliberative species. In this species, the orator advises the audience either to do something or warn against doing something. In turn, the audience must weigh the possible outcomes of what may happen in the future and whether that occurrence is good or bad, if it will serve to help or hinder them. The speech delivered to a court is known as the judicial species. The speaker's purpose is to either accuse an individual or defend the individual or themselves, whatever the case may be. A good example is the speech that Socrates gave prior to his final sentencing. It is an interesting example, for Socrates didn't exactly plead for his life or even profess his innocence, but the setting in which the speech was delivered makes it one of the judicial species. Obviously, Socrates wasn't very persuasive as he was sentenced to death, but one might also say that his intention wasn't to save his own life, but rather to make a point. The final species of persuasion, the Epideictic species, differs from the first two in that the intent is not to convince the listener to choose one side of two opposing parties. Rather, it seeks to establish the shame or honor of an individual based on their past and actions and deeds. This sounds a bit confusing, for it still asks the audience to take one side or the other, but not in the manner of I choose this party over that party, rather seeking to establish one characteristic of one individual. Another way to think about the Epideictic species is that the goal is not to decide an individual's innocence or guilt, but to judge their character, to label them. Rhetoric was originally taught as a third of the Trivium, a liberal arts curriculum taught in the classical societies. The other two-thirds are comprised of grammar, which is basically the same as grammar as we know it today, and dialectic. Dialectic and rhetoric are said to be counterparts of one another. Ropp said, "What dialectic is for the practice of attacking and maintaining an argument, rhetoric is for the practice of defending oneself or accusing an opponent." Rapp went on to say that the dialectic is a private or academic practice, while rhetoric is a public practice. Both are based on the principle of inductive and deductive reasoning and are interested in the opposing sides of an argument. Aristotle drew a distinct correlation between rhetoric and dialectic. He noted not only the several similarities between the two, but also many differences as well. However, the differences only serve to link the two further, as they demonstrate more clearly how they are almost the exact opposite of one another and complement each other in that way completely. What dialectic is, rhetoric is not. The aim of dialectic is to acknowledge both sides of the argument, but not necessarily choose one side over the other or to persuade either side. The goal is to come to a reasonable, rational conclusion, which could come from either of the opposing parties or through a combination of the opposing viewpoints. As we have already come to know, rhetoric is entirely about persuasion. It is an art designed to sway the audience to support the speaker's point of view, be it in the political forum or the courtroom or a community assembly. While the rhetorician acknowledges the opposing viewpoint, he does not seek to come to a rational understanding with his opponent. His goal is to make his argument the one that is recognized by all as the correct and true argument, especially recognized by the opponent in the debate. Because it is an art based on the result of persuasion, rhetoric is not necessarily only applied for positive ventures or good intent. One could very well feign the characteristics that establish credibility with their audience, and also identify with the emotional state, possibly even abusing it. With the impact that emotions have on an individual's decision-making abilities, it is the easiest of the modes of persuasion to abuse and manipulate for one's own gain. Since having one's own interest in mind when forming an argument voids it from being truly persuasive for our purposes, one could argue that attempting to abuse rhetoric's power of persuasion would be fruitless. However, it would be foolish to think that forming a convincing argument that meets all of the requirements for persuasiveness in a rhetorical context, with the true intention of doing harm or anything but good, is out of the realm of possibility. In the hands of the wrong man or woman, any tool in the arena of argument is potentially devastating to what we consider to be good.